Ecological succession is the slow and continuous change in the composition of species and therefore the community structure over periods of time, oftentimes long periods of time. There's two types of succession, primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is succession on a newly exposed site that never had soil and vegetation before. So this would be like when lava runs to the ocean and cools and forms bare rock. That's basically new rock that's never had soil on it before. And that location would be a site of primary succession. So volcanic islands are kind of the place where you would really see this today. Secondary succession is succession on a site that has already had life before, but that has undergone a disturbance such as a fire, tornado, hurricane, or flood. And so as succession occurs, again, it's these gradual changes, and the idea is that it eventually leads to something called the climax community for that area, which is a relatively stable endpoint for a community. What that climax community looks like really depends on the area, the climate, and all that kind of stuff. So one example that has been well studied of succession is in a place called Glacier Bay. In Glacier Bay, a glacier has been retreating for a long time, so hence the name Glacier Bay. So there was a glacier that used to cover the whole area, and it has started to retreat, or has been monitored for retreating of the glacier since the 1800s. And so over the last couple hundred years, there's been various progressive retreating of the glacier, and this is what this figure is showing. So that more and more of it is no longer glaciated. And so once the glacier is gone, that's when succession begins. It leaves behind basically this rocky substrate without any very much soil. And so scientists have been able to track what's been happening at Glacier Bay for a long time, and they can see succession at various stages. So if you go to this part of Glacier Bay here, then this is succession at its end point. But if you travel to Glacier Bay up in this region where the glacier has most recently retreated, then you're seeing succession in its earlier stages. So basically, it creates a really unique opportunity to see succession in many stages. And so what they've established is that the pattern of succession at Glacier Bay starts with bacteria, lichens, and moss. It eventually gives rise to small flowering plants, then shrubs, and finally a forest climax community. And they've been able to measure in great detail how the soil structure and composition changes as these different organisms give way to each other. And so this is a little more information about that. So here's the first stage with the cyanobacteria, moss, and lichens. You can see the rocky debris left behind as the glacier retreats. And really, it's just moss and lichens and bacteria that can survive in this low soil, low nitrogen environment. And then eventually, as the succession progresses, the soil composition changes and small flowering plants are able to get established in the area. The soil depth gets deeper, the nitrogen increases. Then a plant called the alder, which is a shrubby plant, is able to come into the area only again after the flowering plants have come in. And then the alder will give way to the forests of spruce and western hemlock. So all of this is happening through a process called facilitation. So Glacier Bay is an example of succession by facilitation. Oops, let me circle that word there, which means that one species helps establish the next species by changing the soil. So facilitation means to help. So again, one species, the earlier species, is changing the soil and environment in such a way that it will help the next species establish. So in other words, the flowering plants can't arise here until after the moss and lichens have been there doing their work. And the alder can't establish in the area until the mountain avens, the flowering plants, have been there. And the spruce and western hemlock are unable to establish until after the alder, because the alder lays the groundwork, builds the soil, increases the nitrogen in such a way that the spruce and hemlock can survive there. So that's why it always follows this progression, is because one species sets the stage for the next one. I have a couple of other interesting examples of succession. One is at Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is a volcano in Washington State. Maybe you've heard of it. It erupted in 1980. And the whole mountain basically blew up. There was smoke and ashes. My husband's family lived in Idaho at the time, and the ash just rained down on them in Idaho, hundreds of miles away from Mount St. Helens. So heavy it was like snow on their cars, and they were not supposed to go outside so they wouldn't breathe it. So it was just this massive volcanic eruption. And there was forest around Mount St. Helens, and after the eruption, that's what this is a picture of, the forests were essentially decimated. You can see that there's just dead trees, scorched, dead trees turned over. And after Mount St. Helens eruption, mostly they didn't intervene in the area. So they've just left it and let it kind of do whatever it would do. And so what happened was succession occurred. And so if you look at this same area in 1997, so about 20 years later, you see that trees are starting to regrow. So it's starting to return to the climax community. But it followed a succession pattern with early colonizers helping to later the arrival of returning species. So for example, early colonizers do things like mix the ash back into the soil. So there's this big thick layer of ash, and so if this is your soil, this is your ash, you have organisms like little burrowing, that's my burrowing rodent, okay, it's not a very pretty drawing, that moves the ash into the soil and the soil back up to the top, and this helps fix sort of repair the soil so that seeds can come in and can germinate and start growing. So there's a big role for facilitation in recovery from this volcanic eruption. Wildfires similarly create an example of succession. And so we can see succession in the Mountain West, our own region, when we look at fire in Yellowstone National Park. So the story kind of starts before the fire, and this is a continuing challenge for the West, actually. So there's a lot of debate about how much fire control should occur. So should we always put out fires, especially if they're started naturally by, say, lightning? And so for a lot of our recent history in the West, we've had strict fire control policies. That is, as soon as a fire started, no matter what the cause of the fire was, it was immediately put out. And what that led to was really dense forests with a lot of dead trees and debris in them. And so this is what we're seeing here. There's a lot of just debris in here. And so the problem with that is that if a fire does get in here, it has a lot of fuel. More fuel than it would have if it just always had lots of little fires. And so what happened in 1988 in Yellowstone was that some fires started. And in fact, they were naturally occurring. And at first, they just had decided to let fires burn. So fire control policies were starting to change in that time period. And the decision was made to try and let this fire burn through and burn out naturally. But then more fires started, and things just got out of hand. Eventually did have to fight the fires, and it ended up burning up a significant portion of Yellowstone National Park. And one of the issues with what ended up happening was it actually burned into some of the human occupied areas of Yellowstone. So lots of areas of Yellowstone are pretty remote. There's no roads, only backpackers can get there. But what we see in this picture is actually a sign. So the road is right here. This is Grant Village, which is one of the major human hub areas inside of Yellowstone, where there's shopping and camping and lodging and all that kind of stuff. And so the fire really got into the major areas of the park. It burned extremely hot. So when we have small fires, and this was the hope, was a small fire that burns through the low part of the forest and not into the canopy, what you'll see is fire just burn through this part. So again, this would be a kind of the ideal situation. Let me use a different color here, green. Fire would stay down here and would not go up here. And so that keeps the temperature of the fire cooler. It removes debris and fuel, but doesn't actually kill a lot of the trees. But of course, that isn't what happened. The fires got really hot and did burn up into the canopy and killed, again, as I said, a lot of the forest. And so when the fires finally died out, you saw a lot of scenery like this. This forest is just totally dead. These are the remains of the trees. There's no underbrush. And this is a kind of lost and confused elk left wandering through this burned out area. This elk, though, however, is actually providing a service. As in the case of Mount St. Helens, its hooves are starting to remix the ash into the soil. It's carrying in seeds. And so even by a year later, the scenery is transformed. So here's the burned out trees. But what we have as the first stage of succession after a forest fire in the west is an abundance of wildflowers. These wildflowers don't normally grow in the forest, but because the trees have been killed, it lets in light, and these wildflowers can grow there. So they're sort of the consolation prize for a fire. In fact, some of these plants are so dependent on fires for part of their, opportunity to grow. It's actually called fireweed because you typically only see it after a forest fire. If we look at Yellowstone Park 20 years later, we see that these same areas, there's no longer the wildflowers, but you see baby trees starting to grow in among the remains of the dead trees. And so this community is now returning to its climax community. And just to give another illustration of the succession that happened there, this is before the fire from satellite in the Yellowstone area. During the fires, the smoke could be seen by satellite. And remember, this is our old school satellites, not the kind of high-level satellites we have today. And then after the fire, the year after, you can see the large areas of burned out parts of the park. And then when we look in 2008, we can see how most of those areas of burned out, damaged forest are starting to fill back in with green due to this ecological succession.